Welcome to the Flying Leg, Dr. Colin Walker.
Thank you very much for that really incredible welcome. It was almost as if you were talking about somebody else. It sounds pretty good. But anyway. This is our 5th trip to Africa and our 4th trip to South Africa. My wife and I like coming here. We're always flattered by the hospitality we receive.
Excuse me, we can't hear at the back here.
I might actually hold it. Is that any better? Yeah. Great, thank you. So, so we're going to talk about this topic today, a practical guide to maintaining optimal health during racing. So that's an enormously broad topic, and I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes and then take questions for as long as you have questions. But we'll just work our way through it and see what we can cover. I thought you might be interested initially a little bit about Australia. So Australia's 7 times bigger than South Africa, and yet we only have half the population of South Africa, so we're very sparse. We have a lot of open country, and I sort of drew the analogy that it's like removing 13 of every 14 South Africans, and that's our population density. Most of the pigeon racing organisations are in the coastal areas, so Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and Perth, Adelaide as well, quite a strong membership. But the trends of pigeon racing in Australia are similar to the rest of the world. In the 1990s, early 1990s, we had perhaps 10,000 competitive flyers racing their birds each week. We're now probably down to about half of that. And the trend has been more to middle distance, short distance, money races rather than extreme long distance races. But still, we have a very, very distance orientated program. In the Victorian Homing Association, we only have 3 races under 200 miles, and probably only about a quarter of our members bother to actually take clocks home for that. They don't think it's worthwhile clocking a pigeon if it's come to you from under 200 miles. We then have 3 200-mile races, 3 300-mile races, 3 350-mile races, 3 400-mile races, 2 500-mile races, a 600-mile race, 2 races from the south, from Tasmania, where they fly a minimum distance of 120 miles over water, and then we have our 700-mile race from Queensland. There's still into Adelaide every year an 830-mile race from the central desert area of Alice Springs into Adelaide. 5 years ago they flew that race on a day. It was pretty exciting. Into Melbourne, our 700-mile pigeons fly that probably every 4th year on the day, so that's very exciting. In the past in Australia we've had 1,000-mile races, and pigeons return from that.
This quarter we can't hear it very well.
Right, okay, I'll try and speak up a little bit. Sorry about that. So look, we do have a number of significant lifestyle changes as well. Australia is a very, very multicultural country. In my pigeon club, which has about 16 members, we have people of probably 10 different ethnicities. We have Polish people, Maltese people, Chinese people, Greek people, and yet, we all get on very well. We might have slightly different accents. Our parents are born in different countries other than Australia, but we all regard ourselves as Australians, and Australians as a whole are very proud of that sort of multicultural society. We think that it adds, to the richness of Australia. So it's an interesting country in that way. We have very, very low crime rates, and this is probably a little bit foolhardy on my behalf, but we've just shifted. But prior to last year when we did shift, we lived on 6 acres, a house in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne for 25 years. We never locked that house. Every day the house would empty, we would all go to work. Each night we'd all come home. We'd go away on a month's holiday, even overseas. We never locked that house. Just walked out the door each day. It's very different. The other big difference, of course, we're 8 hours ahead of you. I only arrived yesterday, so my bio clock is telling me that it's about 6 o'clock in the evening right now, so it's a little bit different. So let's talk a little bit about how we can get the pigeons really healthy for racing. So I guess a very common thing that our initial contact with pigeon fanciers is they'll ring up and they say, my pigeons, they sometimes say they have a diagnosis, my pigeons have wet canker, my pigeons have respiratory infection, or they might say, my pigeons are panting, my pigeons have diarrhea, and it's very important not to confuse symptoms with the diagnosis. And so, we're very keen to accurately diagnose problems in that peculiar situation, but also in lots over time generally to see what problems are present in that loss, so we can figure out longer term health management programs for that individual loss. And I guess that has multiple benefits because it means that people aren't buying medication that they don't need, and medications are expensive, and the pigeons aren't getting medication they don't need. One trend that I do find around the world is that pigeon fanciers as a whole are often quite keen to buy drugs for their pigeons, but they're not keen to pay for advice on how to use those drugs correctly. And so misuse of medications in pigeons is very common. So the very common diagnostic tests, and I guess most of you in this room would be familiar, but it's worth spending just 5 minutes to sort of whiz through that. And so how do we monitor the common diseases? So a very, very common diagnostic test is a simple thing called the crop flush. And all that involves is just passing a tube down into the bird's crop. And different ways that can be done, but I just put a little bit of negative pressure on that so that the crop wall sucks onto the end of the tube, and I just gently pull that out and vacuum a section of the crop wall as we go. When I pull that tube out, I've got a small amount of sort of salivary mucus type material there, and I just put that onto a slide, put a cover slip on top, and have a look down the microscope. And to an experienced veterinarian, that's literally going to take 20 seconds. And usually we just look down the microscope by 100 magnification, so 10 on the eye, 10 on the deck, and that's what it looks like. And that's what a pigeon magnified 100 times under the microscope looks like with wet canker. So those tiny little things that you see there are canker organisms, and you think, well, God, that could be canker, it could be anything, but microscope's just a straight light microscope. I usually put it up to 400 times, and at 400 times you can see the organisms very easily swimming around. You can see their internal structures. Each a single-celled organism, a bit like an amoeba that you might have learned about at in biology at school, have a few tails called flagella. That's why they're called flagellates. And the important thing is that all flagellates in birds are pathogenic, so they could all cause disease. So we want to know if they're there or not. Other things you might see, this is another crop flush, and the big circle on the right-hand side there are pigeon white blood cells called heterophils. The sort of football ones on the left-hand side, are red blood cells. So that's what we might find or alert us to the presence of respiratory infection in a pigeon. So if that pigeon has an inflammatory process in the air sacs or trachea, he's going to cough and bring up that inflammatory debris. If he's got an eye cold or a sinus infection or a dirty sear, it's still a few days away from being visible to you in the loft. You're going to get those inflammatory discharges come down through the slough in the roof of the mouth, down the back of the throat, and you'll see those changes. So the pigeon might look okay, but they might be reluctant to fly or look a bit quiet, and the veterinarian might think, oh, look, there's some inflammatory changes in that throat, and we're going to have to investigate that further. So second very common test is just looking at droppings. So that's very straightforward. So again, we just get a little sample of droppings. I just put tap water on it. You can put saline if you want to. And we just mix that up into a fecal slurry. Put the microscope slide on that. Initially look at it by 100, and then we just go back up to 400. That's coccidiosis under 100. I haven't got a marker, so I can't point it out, but going up to 400 times, those little sort of basketball type structures there are coccidia. So that's the second really common disease, of course. So, quick and easy. Does anyone want to tell me what that is? Yes, that's excellent. Yeah, so that's a hairworm, magnified 400 times. So again, looking at droppings, we get a lot of information very quickly, very easily. The other thing we do more and more these days is draw blood from pigeons. We get an enormous amount of information about how fit they are, whether they're being overworked, whether they have any nutritional deficiency, things like calcium deficiency, iron deficiency, a diet that's too high in fat, a diet that's low in protein. All those things can be picked up. Subclinical infections can be picked up with elevated white cell counts, iron-induced anemias, things like that. So we draw blood either from the jugular vein, about 10% of a pigeon's weight in grams is their blood volume in mils. So most race birds weigh about 400 grams, so they have 40 mils of blood, and it's very safe to take 10% of a pigeon's blood volume, which is 4 mils. In fact, we can run every test that we need to run on only a quarter of a mil of blood, so the pigeons don't even know that it's gone. And in fact, it's possible to draw 10% of a pigeon's blood 10 times over a 24-hour period, and that pigeon will be fine. They can make blood very fast, and they have a number of mechanisms to compensate. So we draw blood, and sometimes we draw it from the wing as well. Never in a race bird, we don't want to create any soreness there. But the nurses in an avian practice are very trained. Just hold the pigeon down, very fine needle, 27 gauge, pull out a few drops of blood, and then we just run it through. Now, what do we do? Initially, we run biochemistry, haematology. In Australia, that takes about 4 hours to do. So we get very quick, very usable information, and all the tests that we do there, and there's, we can't interpret each of those. But essentially, on the left-hand side, they're all your organ function tests. On the right-hand side, there are your different sorts of white blood cells and red blood cell parameters. So very useful. Enormous amount of information very quickly. We then want to look very specifically for specific diseases, and the one we want to know, of course, one of the ones we want to know is chlamydia. So chlamydia is the most common cause of respiratory infection in racing pigeons, a number of different ways of diagnosing that. A very common way is this thing called a chlamydia immunochrome test. What it picks up is a particular amount of an immunoglobulin in the pigeon's blood that's produced there in response to chlamydial infection. So this takes about 2.5 hours to do. We draw literally a drop of blood. It just goes through, the nurses do this, goes through a series of steps, put the sample into an extraction fluid, and we get just a change in the test paper if there's a positive. So there's just a negative and a positive. There's a coloured spot which comes up if you've done the test correctly. A lower coloured spot comes up if there's that organism there. So there's a left positive one on the right-hand side. And this is another very common test. I was talking to Dr. Rock earlier today about this. These are the new rapid SNAP tests that have become available for pigeons. So what these are is things called ELISA tests, and what they do is pick up disease organisms in a sample. These tests take about 2.5 minutes to do, and they just detect the organisms there. So I've got one here, I'll hand it around and have a look while we're talking, but for Salmonella, which this test is for, all we would do is get a sample that we want tested, and that could be droppings, it could be fluid from an infected joint, it could be fluid from around an ovary during an autopsy. We just take that sample, put in the extraction fluid, get the supernatant, drop it onto a test paper, it diffuses through the test paper, you get a line come up if the test's done correctly, you get a second line come up if the organism is there. So for example with Salmonella, in the past, if we thought, oh, these birds have got diarrhoea, is that Salmonella? I've got a few birds that are dragging up just one wing after they've been flying and they knock themselves, or could there be a Salmonella arthritis there? In the past, we had to get that sample, send to the lab, get the lab to culture the bacteria. Very hard organism to grow, get large amounts of negative results. It would take 4 or 5 days to get a result. In Australia, that would cost about $100 to do. And only then do you get the results, and you then have to act on that. With these rapid tests, 2.5 minutes, yes, there's some Salmonella there, no, there's not. In Australia, this test costs under $10, so it's very cheap. I'll just pass it round, have a look. Yeah, so just a sec here. So all that you've got there is you just snap the top off, wipe that through the droppings, put it into the fluid sample, stir it around, flick the top off, 4 drops in there, and it diffuses through there. So it's very easy.
Are they available in South Africa now?
I imagine so. We've got a lot to get those. These are cutting edge a little bit. We've only had them in Australia a few months. And you know, our own South African country that services the world fantastically, molecular diagnostic services with Dr. York. So we use him in Melbourne. So we do PCR, so polymerase chain reactions, looks for organisms' DNA. So another test available to us. So the top test there is checking for Chlamydia and Pigeon circumvirus, and we can see that guy's positive. So it's a bad news day for him, but we can work with that. And of course, it's always a matter of matching the degree of diagnostic work with the degree of the problem. And so if people come in and they've been having poor race performance, nothing particularly jumps out at you when you talk about his management and his diet, and routine tests all come back negative, you can just upgrade and do further tests. And we want to sort of get to the bottom of the problem, but as economically and as expediently as we can. But sometimes it becomes necessary to pick a bird, a cull bird hopefully, that's displaying the symptoms that are of concern, and we'll euthanise that bird, do a full autopsy, get our tissue samples. Those tissue samples need to go off to a specialist avian pathologist, someone who looks at a lot of birds. It's no good going off to a government vet who sees one avian case a month. He's not going to have the expertise to pick up subtle changes that might affect race of one. But an avian pathologist who's seeing birds all the time, they'll get answers for you. Perhaps more specialised procedures in a veterinary clinic, but avian endoscopy is very common. We have entry points into an anaesthetised pigeon. We just pluck little areas, sterilise it, run the endoscope in, have a look around, see what we can see. So, if you've got an infertility problem, these 6-7-year-old cocks aren't filling their eggs anymore. Have they got an infection? Have they got a tumour? Have they got a cyst? Or have they been born with a problem? We can just knock them out, put the endoscope in, have a look and see. We can put endoscope guided swabs, take samples, get answers very quickly. And we x-ray them, of course. And this, of course, is another very important thing. So our bacterial cultures still have their place. And so if people come in and the pigeons are panting after moderate exercise, there's been an outbreak of sneezing, we're running a chlamydia immunocome test, that's negative. We're running a chlamydia rapid test, that's negative. We think, well, what's going on? So we might take a swab, send that to the lab, get them to grow the bacteria that are there. The reason for doing that is that once you can put a name to the bacteria that are causing that infection, well, then you know the whole biology of that disease. So, for example, common causes might be a bacteria called Campylobacter. Campylobacter is often carried by wild perching birds like sparrows. So you think, okay, if we don't do this sort of test, you might have an outbreak of sneezing. You buy some antibiotics, you treat the birds, they get better, but in a month the problem's back. And you think, oh, well, we just give them more antibiotics. If you can do a bit more thorough testing, you can say, oh, the reason they're doing this is it's Campylobacter from the wild birds that, are getting in through the traps. It's Pseudomonas from the contaminated water source that I'm using. Once you can identify the bacteria, where's the source, we can eliminate that, and it doesn't keep coming back. So there's lots of handy spin-offs for doing that. So we take swabs, we do sinus flushes, so our pigeons don't have a dividing septum in their head, so you can just flush sterile saline into one nostril, collect what drips out the other side, grow that, and identify getting a nice little sort of micro population of the bacteria that are in the sinus there and grow them. And this is just the report that a veterinarian would get back from that bacterial culture. You can see on the top there, all the common antibiotics have been tested for, and it's resistant to everything. And that's something we see very commonly, particularly like trying to diagnose Salmonella, because often they come to us after people have used this antibiotic, and dealing with multiple resistant strains has become very difficult to control. So this is why we get our results back. And this is another test called a Grand stain. This helps us identify the bacteria. Now, I guess the other thing too, as we were saying about the population dynamics in Australia, where we all live in the coastal area, and most of the big capital cities don't have large numbers of avian veterinarians, and most general practitioner veterinarians, if you take a pigeon in there, even if it's a tumbler, they might ask you, is this a racing pigeon? Or, they can't hold it properly. And it's not reasonable to expect a general practitioner to be able to advise you on, the common pigeon diseases. And so often you know, what happens is you're dealing with veterinarians with avian ability at a significant distance from you. So it's not practical to take a pigeon in there all the time. And so, you know, how can you work with a veterinarian like that to still get useful information? Well, these days, of course, it is possible. And, you know, these rapid tests, the immunocombs, they can all be mailed in, and so can dead pigeons and live pigeons can be proved. And I think this case here illustrated that quite well. So this was just a dead pigeon that was sent in to the clinic. The nurses joke that, you know, the postman must think that we get a lot of hate mail because people mail us poo and dead birds. But you know, so this was a dead bird that arrived, and so we opened its mouth and we saw that. So what we're looking at there is sort of dried exudate that's weeped away from the lining of the mouth. So presumably at a microscopic level the mouth is ulcerated, inflammatory materials come away. If that was, say, a 3 or 4 month old pigeon and that had been skinny, diarrhea and died after 3 or 4 days, and you opened the mouth and saw that, what would come to the top of your mind? Sorry? Yes, so they're all good answers. Anything else? Yeah. So look, canker might look like that, but young bird disease is circovirus, of course, and this did turn out to be circovirus. So for me, a pigeon at that age, I would always think of some viral disease, you know, perhaps complicated by canker. So that might be circo, sometimes PMV, herpes, certainly. So we thought, oh, you know, circo is very common in Australia. So we did think of circo initially, and so and other things we saw that the bird's obviously thin. The other thing, if you look at that bird's flight, what are you seeing there? So it's a young bird that's molting. It's completely grown its 4th adult flight without molting its 5th baby flight. So that's a retarded molt. So that bird hasn't been well for some time. It's going at full wing. It should have dropped its next flight, shouldn't it? And so at autopsy, that creamy ball structure in the middle of the abdomen that we've opened there is actually a pigeon's bursa. It's a tonsil-like structure. It disappears when they go through puberty, and that becomes full of inflammatory debris with circovirus. It's a very high-yield site for circovirus, and so we took a swab from that, we did a PCR, and that came back positive. And so that guy lived something like 400 miles from us, was having small numbers of pigeons die. He posted that pigeon into us, and we can accurately diagnose for him what the problem is, even though he's that distance away. You just logically work it through. You know, we had other tech samples away, you know, but we can diagnose that for him. This is what a canker swab looks like. If you know, your pigeons, you've just fed them, called them in after exercise, you've got a lot of them leaning back on their tail. They're gulping again and again, trying to force the grain down. Is it that just their throats are dry? You know, they've been panting while they've been flying. Is the maize overly big? Is there too much linseed that's sticking to the side of the throat? Or have they got inflamed throats and they're trying to chug grain down through a sore throat? If they're doing that, it's most likely wet canker. Is it wet canker or not? How can we tell? Just put any cotton bud in the pigeon's throat, whiz it round the throat, stick it into this growth, this medium, snap the top off, put it in the post. When we get that in the post, we just tip that liquid onto a microscope slide. It's exactly the same as having the pigeon in the clinic, and then you can just bring the guy back and say, yes, there's lots of trikes there, or no, there's not. And this photo was actually sent to me last year by a guy in Cape Town, and he said, oh, my pigeon's got a funny eye. And so this pigeon's bleeding into the front of its eye. It's a thing called hyphema, and you know, there's a list of what are the likely things involved with that. So you can use the technology and, you know, send emails, send images. People email videos of pigeons flying, and we can get lots of samples, you know, drop-ins, birds, other tests that we might send out, like these rapid tests, and tell people how to collect the sample and send in to us. So we can get accurate diagnoses pretty efficiently these days. So canker. So what are the diseases that need to be kept on top of during racing to really have the birds maximally healthy? So probably the one that initially that everyone mentions is canker. And so that's what canker looks like under the microscope. This is what we were talking about before, single-celled organisms. You know, the nurses are funny. We kept one canker organism alive as a pet in the clinic, for a number of weeks. We wanted to know how long it would live for, and he was really good until someone accidentally put him in the freezer. And the girls called him Fatso, and Fatso, our pet canker organism, was frozen and died. Anyway, so look, the way canker works, I guess when I was a child, racing pigeons, canker was a yellow nodule in the throat. If they didn't have the yellow nodule, they didn't have canker. It was as simple as that. And but we know that's not the case. Canker just refers to flagellates in the throat. If they've got lots of organisms there, if there's damage to the throat, those organisms can progress to the stage where they will cause what you're seeing as a canker nodule, which is really a canker abscess in the pigeon's throat. But as they get older and they get some immunity, their response to trichomonas exposure is modified, and so you get lots and lots of these flagellate organisms living in the throat. Can't see a lot to the naked eye, but they're a parasite, and their presence compromises performance. And I guess a bad way of looking at things is if you take a racing pigeon along to a vet and he does a throat swab, and there's lots of canker organisms there, the immediate thing obviously is to give them an anti-canker drug. But you sort of think, why is that organism there? Because it's really a failure of that pigeon to form a natural immunity to that organism. So certainly you want to think, okay, we're going to treat this pigeon with an anti-canker drug, get rid of those flagellar organisms, but why are they there in the first place? That may well represent a management flaw in the sort of the whole breeding season, post-weaning time, and as things proceed. The way canker tends to work is that all stock birds are going to have a few of these flagellar organisms in their throat all the time, and as they when they start producing crop milk, there's a hormone there called prolactin, and the canker organism has evolved to sense that, so that young stock birds feeding babies with milk will always have lots of canker organisms in their throat. That's a normal state. The parasite has evolved with pigeons over millennia and adapted itself so it will be passed to the next generation and continue on. But in a well-managed loft, what happens is those youngsters, when they're being given the canker organisms along with the crop milk, they don't get sick. That low-grade intermittent exposure to canker, it's just like allowing kids to go out and play in the dirt. It challenges those young pigeons' immune system, and they start to form their own natural immunity to those low-grade intermittent exposure to canker organisms. If we misuse drugs around that time, and so I've got a few youngsters with canker, what I think I'll do is I'll give the whole lot, a very potent anti-canker drug like ronidazole for 5 or 6 days. You might stop canker organisms being in the young pigeon's throat for a short period of time, but what it means is they're getting that critical exposure they need through a critical time of their development, and they're not days, recheck them. Have they gone? Is your organism sensitive to that drug? If they're not gone, we have to try another one, figure out which one is best for your lot, but then periodically recheck them to find out, based on the strain you keep, your lot environment, your management, the natural immunity, how long it takes for those organisms to come back. And once you know that for your lot, you know how often is the appropriate interval to treat them. So, for example, with my own lot, I find that, I'd like to think I care for them pretty well, but about on the third week, if I don't treat them, I start to get flagellates appearing in my birds' crop flushes. And so I know now that about every third week, I'll just give them 2 or 3 days, the whole team, not returning race birds, every bird in the lot, not the stock lot, the race lot, we'll just have 2 or 3 days on an anti-canker drug, and that will keep the team pretty well free of wet canker in my lot. Well, again, that's based on treatment. When new drugs like the ronidazole, first became invented, and that was only about in the early 90s, I think, wasn't it? That was a fantastic drug. What we would find is that just a single big drink, pigeons would go and they guzzle that down, and you check them the next day, and what you'd see is the canker organisms would still be there, but they would have lost their motility, they're dead. They're just sitting there, and another day you'd crop flush them and they're all gone. We have really resistant ones now because people treat low doses, short period of time, and we have people that use ronidazole and they're back on their crop flush, and it's made no difference at all. And so then we have to try another one, or we try drug combinations. One product that works very well in Australia, and this is a MedPet product, thank God, but I just mentioned they're quite independent. But their product, I think they still make it, a thing called Ronasec, that contains ronidazole and secnidazole. Secnidazole is not widely used in Australia, and so that's very effective in Australia. We just give them 2 tablets 48 hours apart, and we haven't had any resistance to that yet. But that will come, but it hasn't been used widely in Australia, so most strains are still resistant to that. Sensitive, sorry. So respiratory infection. So everyone is very familiar with the obvious signs of respiratory infection that you would get in a young pigeon in that post-weaning time. So your eye colds, your heavy, staining of the cere, nasal discharge, things like that. In race-age birds, because they're older, because they have immunity, the symptoms can be grossly modified by that, and you get very mild symptoms. And so this pigeon here, can you see the change there on that? Yeah, so what's happening there is there's been inflammatory fluid released into that bird's sinus. It's draining from one sinus to another through the holes that connect them, and eventually it's ended up running under the nose on its way down to the slot in the roof of the mouth, and as it flows under the cere, it's staining that. And so we're seeing that that's just like pigeon pus, soaking through their nose. That's what we're saying. Now, I'll just draw this. Give me a sec. So, everyone, when they're looking at a pigeon's throat, most pigeon races during a race season, if you ask them to feel a pigeon, they're going to feel its muscles, they're going to open a wing and what stages it's molting and its feather quality, and most of them are going to look down the throat. And so if you're looking down the throat, what do you see that might indicate that there's a real problem there? It's no good just saying, oh, look, it looks a bit mucus here, or it looks a little bit red. I find very little correlation between those sort of changes with whether there is any chlamydia or respiratory infection or wet canker. So the structures are that are absolutely a shocking drawer, but if that's the top beak, and if that's the bottom beak like that, now you have what we call the choana, or the slot, up here like that, and you have these little structures sticking out here that are called spicules, like this. And then we all recognise that slightly more purple area that runs from the back of that, and so this runs, this is very bad, it runs down diagonally like that, to the corner of the throat, and we've got that little fringe area across the bottom there that we've all seen. That triangular area there is called the pharyngeal tonsil. It's a big tonsil in pigeons. The line down through the centre of that is called the infradibular cleft. It just divides the two tonsils. And in the centre of that is the tube, a thing called the eustachian tube that runs down from the pigeon's ear. Now we have our ears, we have the canals that run from the ears, one each into our throat. In pigeons, those two canals join in the middle, and then there's just one opening, and that comes in the centre there. So, and then you've got the joints, shows you where it is, like that. And then inside the lower beak, what you have is the tongue. I'll talk. Yeah. And so we have the tongue, and then at the entrance of the tongue, at the top of the windpipe, it's called the glottis. And at that glottis, you have the pigeon's second tonsil, and that's a thing called the laryngeal mound. Okay, so that's the basic anatomy we're looking at.
Now, for the guys up the back that couldn't hear that, just very, very quickly to recap. So you've got the top beak, the lower beak, and inside the lower beak you have the tongue, the opening to the windpipe here, and a tonsil-like structure called the laryngeal mound. In the top beak, you have the choana, or the slot, surrounded by these little hair-like structures called spicules. This triangular structure at the bottom here, which is usually a different colour so you can see it, and that's called their pharyngeal tonsil, with a little fringe or further spicules along there, and this groove down the middle in the infradibular cleft and the opening of the eustachian tube. So that's the normal anatomy. Now, so in this pigeon here, what you can see, so if you get an infection in the sinus, inflammatory material will drain from the sinus. You can see on the left-hand side there, some of that pussy material is coming out through the nose. But you can also see how the edge of the slot is swollen, and it's swollen a little bit closed. Now that's just because the infection that's infecting the lining of the sinus, that slot is the visible part of the sinus you can see. So it's just swelling there. And this is, like that race cock looks pretty well. But you're seeing that mucus there. Now, all pigeons have a little bit of mucus in the throat, and that cock could be quite well. But seeing that amount of mucus there, particularly running from the slot down to the top of the windpipe, it just indicates to you that maybe there's an inflammatory process going on. And so you might want to do a chlamydia test, or get the vet to do a chlamydia test first. You might want to get the vet to do a bacterial culture, and just investigate whether that is an issue or not. Now that's an interesting thing. So that is a small abscess in the bird's laryngeal mound. Now, if the pigeons have an inflammatory process going on in their throat, it's like us. Initially their tonsils will swell, become red, become sore for the pigeon. But as that inflammatory process continues, you get these little micro abscesses, they're little pustule pimples within the tonsil material. If they occur in the pharyngeal tonsil, that could be canker, it could be respiratory infection, a whole range of things. But if that occurs in the laryngeal mound, because that's the tonsil that sits inside the entrance to the windpipe, that pigeon has a respiratory infection. There's very few things where a veterinarian will look at you and say, definitely that's what's going on, but this is one of them. So if you've got pigeons with swollen laryngeal mounds, abscesses in their laryngeal mounds, they have a respiratory infection. But saying they have a respiratory infection, that isn't a diagnosis. All you've done is identified where an infection is in the bird's system. You need to then run the test to find out what's causing that infection. And this is the same process but in the pharyngeal tonsil. And we've all seen that, little micro abscesses in the pharyngeal tonsil. That's a slightly clearer shot. Okay. And so this again is respiratory infection. So that pussy material that's coming down from the sinus, coming out through the nostril, that's just come down through the slot. You can see the anterior edge of that swollen closed. As that's coming down into the throat, just the pigeon normal swallowing action, moving the tongue is smearing that pus around the roof of the bird's mouth. That looks like that. And it's also smeared it around the inside of the lower beak as well. So you're seeing that as well. And that's a classic severe abscess in the laryngeal mound. Okay? So you're looking at those structures and looking for those changes. And there's a bird with really severe respiratory infection. You can see that that bird's actually having trouble oxygenating its blood, so the mucous membrane is taking on a bluish type appearance. You can see the inflammatory material bubbling out through the choana. You can see how swollen those tonsils are. They're swollen to the point that the little spicules on the back of the pharyngeal mound are no longer visible. And you can see where the pharyngeal mound is swollen away, from the rest of the palate. Okay. So, management of chlamydia and through the sort of the breeding and the post-weaning time is very similar to the way we would manage canker. So, small numbers of birds you just treat individually, large numbers of birds you give as a flock treatment. But if respiratory infection is still active in the birds as racing approaches, you think, well, why is that so? We have to look back on our management. And so people will say, I've given my birds, preventative treatment for respiratory infection, and many fanciers do that, whether they really know whether they need it or not. So we use these 4 criteria to decide whether a race team is going to benefit from being treated for respiratory infection prior to racing. So the first thing, of course, is the disease still active in the birds even though they look normal, and that's determined through testing. And so that can be done a number of ways. With those rapid tests, we just take some of the mucus from the throat, run it through, wait 3 or 4 minutes, is there a colour change there? That's probably the quickest and easiest these days. You can do the familial PCRs that we talked about, you do your immunocones, and draw a drop of blood, do a white cell count. Pigeons get massively high white cell counts with chlamydial infection. So got lots of ways of knowing that's there. So you think, okay, they look fine, but I don't want to start my season off with pigeons with respiratory infection. We don't want to go the wrong way round where I have that toss and lose, a quarter to a third of the birds, then take them to the vet and find they've got respiratory infection. If it's there, I want to know now. I've got time now because it's still a month before racing starts. Are they going to get benefit from giving them antibiotics or not? So you can run the tests. They might look normal, but the tests are positive. They're there. We're going to treat them. If chlamydial infection was a problem during the previous year, and if nothing's changed about the loft, if they struggled to form a natural immunity last year, why would it be any different this year? You've got the same pigeons, same loft, you've done it all the same, racing season's going to be the same, you've got the same triggers, it'll happen again. So we would often treat in that situation. If there's been a significant amount of respiratory infection in the post-weaning time, that would again make us think, there was concurrent circovirus or management flaw like overcrowding. Again, we might treat them with that. Or, of course, if they have visible respiratory infection now, we would treat them. So that helps us decide. So which drug do you use? Is Baytril a brand here in South Africa? So people will commonly say, I'll use Baytril. That is a very poor choice for respiratory infection in this situation. And the reason for that is that with chlamydia, it's an intracellular bacteria replicates itself there, cells rupture full of organisms, they go into adjacent cells, things like that. What Baytril does is it stops the organism replicating itself, and so the pigeon will appear to get better. But Baytril doesn't actually clear the organism from the cell, and so when the medication is withdrawn, relapses are very common. So you get doomed to using another course, another course, another course. So Baytril is not a good choice in that situation. Doxycycline, it's tetracycline antibiotics, of which doxycycline is one. Tetracyclines are your best group of antibiotics to use in the most usual situation against chlamydia. Doxycycline is your best choice over other tetracyclines because it is less affected by concurrent calcium intake if you leave the griffin a lot. It doesn't cause the same disruption to normal bowel bacteria. But most importantly, after a single drink, it provides effective blood levels for 20 hours. The other ones like Chlortet, Oxytet, which is terramycin, it's only 4 hours. So that means unless a pigeon is going to drink every 4 hours, the level of antibiotic in that bird system is up, down, up, down, up, down, and they don't drink through the night. So they're going to, even if they have a drink at dusk, they go up and they sit on the perch, they're going to sit there for 8 to 10 hours after the first 4 hours, there's no antibiotic in their system. So but they're going to drink every 20 hours. So the doxycycline get high, the system blood levels, and a much quicker response to treatment. Have you got any questions about that? Because we're really whizzing through here. Okay, so the parasitic diseases, and these are the things that we never want in the pigeons. And so we just whiz through these. So worms. Worms are very common still, surprisingly. There's a whole range of very effective medications. As few as 6, enough to put a race pigeon off form. About 300 will kill them. So, so there's just common sense. You would either periodically worm them. It's not going to do the pigeons any harm. It's different than the canker drugs or antibiotics. Or better still, just mail some droppings in, get a vet to have a look at them. If there's worms there, you just treat them. It's really simple. This is what a hairworm looks like under the microscope. Just a hollow tube full of eggs. It's incredible, really. So, roundworms, if they can have 300 roundworms, half the females, 150 females, each produces thousands of eggs every day. The environmental contamination is enormous. So, that's just hairworm eggs in a pregnant female hairworm. And tapeworms, of course, really common as well. So, those. It's droppings from a single pigeon, the morning after being given a tapeworm tablet. That brandy material is just a pile of tapeworms there. They're common medications that are used. There's plenty of others on the market that are equally effective. I use those in my own birds for what it's worth. Moxidectin is very, very safe. Praziquantel is very safe. We have a product in Australia that contains the 2 of them. It's water soluble. It's very quick and very easy. The other parasites, we've got to keep on top of our worms. The other parasite is coccidia, and so that's what coccidia looks like under the microscope. 4 coccidia eggs there, magnified 400 times. Lots of different coccidia drugs. I guess the one that's most commonly used in Australia is toltrazural. The brand name's Toltravet. That's the dose rate there. The thing with coccidia is its pre-patent period is quite short. What that means, the pre-patent period is the time it takes for a new infection to start after a treatment if the bird's infected straight away. So what that means is if you treat them for coccidia, put them back in the same loft, they swallow a coccidia egg the next day, how long is it before the infection's back? 6 days. Haven't gained very much. To break that reproduction cycle, the usual thing is to give them a 2-day treatment if you're using toltrazural, and then you wait 5 days and then give them another 2-day treatment. And as much as you can do to get rid of the eggs from the environment in between, the better. During that time, the better. Disinfectants don't kill coccidia eggs. Scrubbing, disinfecting in the loft doesn't work. The usual thing is to burn them off. So you just get a little, gas-fired things, and burn the type thing, and just go through and burn the loft down. And burn the loft. Take all the straw on the floor out first. I can tell you that's exposed. But yes, you haven't seen an Australian get move very quickly until you see a bit of straw kept on the floor of a racing loft, and boy. Yes, so anyway, so that's easy to control, and these, and I guess the drugs that we recommend these particular ones because they're safe to use during racing. Ronidazole, very quickly excreted from the body, for example. If you treat your birds Sunday, Monday, Tuesday with that, and then they're basketed on the Thursday, that drug's gone from their system. They're drug-free, it's not affecting them anyway. It's effective treatment, gone from their system very quickly. Toltravet persists for longer in the system, but it doesn't affect racing. And parasites, lice, mites, other things are really common. It's surprising the number of race birds that go through with these on, and some of the birds that are presented to us for autopsy have enormous burdens. Like this photo here. That's a race hen that came in, or it's a baby obviously, came in for a death examination. When the body cools, the external parasites jump ship, and so we did autopsy in this bird. While I'm autopsying, God, look at these lice, coming out. And it wasn't particularly obvious, at the start of the autopsy, but as you can see, they're evolved to flatten. They sit down between the veins of the feather there. And, I just don't think it can be a good thing. Restless, interrupts their night's sleep, affects feather quality. What you don't want to be doing is instigate insect treatments that are disruptive to race birds during the race training. You don't want to upset them. So what can you do? Stock pigeons, I just dip them in permethrin. The permethrin that's available in Australia has a wetting agent in it already. We just put 5 mils per litre, make them a little warm, pick a warm day, and I just pick each stock bird. They hate me that day. I just pick them up, I just put their whole body underneath, swish them around for a second, and let them go. And they all run into the corner. They look like drowned rats. You think half of them are going to die in a few hours, but they preen themselves off. No, they're fine. With race birds, there's no way you want to do that. And so what I use, a little trick, that drug that I use, mentioned up there, the moxidectin. Moxidectin kills any external parasite that feeds off blood or tissue fluid. And so if you treat race birds with moxidectin, you'll kill all their moths, but not their lice. But if it touches the organism, it will kill them that way. So I just put moxidectin in the bath water at a 10th the oral dose. So 0.5 ml per litre. It works into a froth, so fill the bath first, and then just put 0.5 ml of moxidectin for every litre in the bath water. The water's clear, the pigeons can't tell it's medicated, there's no head on it, and they just go and splash around and come out with all the parasites. It's as simple as that. So talk about that a bit. Now, salmonella, this is a really interesting area because when I was younger, what we were told is that salmonella was a common problem in pigeons. They caught it from rodents, so mice and rats, things like that. We now know that's completely not true. The salmonella that infects pigeons is hostess-adapted salmonella. It only affects pigeons. It's extremely rarely isolated from any other species, and when it's there, it's thought to be a contaminant. There was one published paper where 10,000 cases of salmonella were isolated from pigeons, and in all bar 7 of those cases, so 9,993 of them, were one of these 2 strains. And so the actual organism is Salmonella enterica, Typhimurium Copenhagen, and these Anderson phage types DT2 and DT99. So the way pigeons catch salmonella is from birds that are carrying it in their system and from a contaminated environment. That's the way they get it. And it's a fascinating thing because I was lucky enough to speak at the AU convention in New York a few years ago, and Carlo Grisselbeck was there, and the guy who runs the PIPA site, and I'd never met him before, and we get to know each other. We went out for dinner together, and I was saying, salmonella, we don't see that so much in Australia, and he said, Germany and Western Europe, that's a big problem. We have to vaccinate our birds, and we detect it a lot, and it's a real issue. I thought, maybe for one reason or another, salmonella is not a problem in Australia. And anyway, the interesting thing is that since we've had these snap tests and other, fairly quick tests, is that when we're just doing our routine profiles on race birds that look clinically quite normal, a lot of them do have salmonella in their system, in their bowel, not in their system. And so what do? That's if you find salmonella in the dropping of a clinically normal pigeon, what does that mean? Probably nothing. It certainly doesn't have the disease that salmonella causes, which is paratyphoid. But what it does mean is that if that pigeon hasn't formed a good immunity to salmonella during the post-weaning and the growth time, and it comes under the stress of racing, that salmonella can invade into the bowel wall and cause inflammation of the bowel wall, so that's your classic salmonella enteritis and your green wet droppings. Or if the pigeon has very little immunity, it can invade through the bowel wall, get into the bloodstream, and that's where you get your salmonella meningitis, your twisted necks and things like that, and your bacterial infections of the joints. And so we've found probably half of race birds in Australia have salmonella in their droppings. And so is that an indication for treatment? No, it's not. But what it tells you is that if those birds come under stress, as Carlo was suggesting, then it will invade the bowel and you get those a few days of green droppings and you give them antibiotics and they come good. And so what we do is we think that's very much a strong indication to immunise the birds against salmonella. And so salmonella vaccines have had a really checkered history, but some of the vaccines that are available now are tremendously effective. And the one that we use in Australia is being produced by a company called Bioproperties. Bioproperties is a huge multinational, multi-million-dollar, 600-employee company, and ironically their world headquarters is about 5 kilometres north of my clinic. And so what they've done is they've developed the Salmonella Vaccine for pigeons, and what they've done is modified the enzyme pathway in that allows the Salmonella to reproduce itself, and so that it can't. And so the vaccine is alive, and you give the pigeons an injection back of the neck, same as you would TMV, and it sets up a temporary infection of about 3 or 4 hours. But the organism can't reproduce itself and it quickly dies out. But in response to that transient infection, the pigeons are exposed both to the bacteria itself, so all the antigens on the bacteria surface, but also the toxins that that bacteria produces. And so Salmonella Bioproperties hired us to run the vaccine trials for that government, for that vaccine, and then the University of Melbourne did all the testing. And so we got all pigeons together, we gave them the various vaccine strengths and time intervals and things like that, drew all the blood. That all went down to the University of Melbourne, and they estimated the amount of immunity the pigeons formed. And the amount of immunity they formed was extremely high. And so this vaccination has been embraced very widely in Australia. It's very cheap, costs something like 3 cents a pigeon to do. It's a water-based inoculation done twice, 2 weeks apart. It can be given the same time as your PMV shots or pigeon pox. And so people just do that. And so what it means is that if your pigeons come in contact with salmonella, those pigeons might still get salmonella in their bowel, but their immunity is very strong at the bowel lining, and the salmonella can't invade and cause disease. So it's just a way of eliminating the disease that can flare and put pigeons off form during race. Yes.
We had a problem with the vaccine that was supplied by some producers. I can't name them, but I know it's very dangerous. You use the wrong stuff, you can trouble.
And look, that's a really valid concern, because it's interesting, just sort of talking about the vaccination process a little bit longer, with paramyxovirus, for example. Paramyxovirus, it was our clinic, it was actually me that diagnosed the first paramyxovirus case ever in Australia.
We only had it in 2012, we had it in the 90s already.
Yes, exactly. It was only New Zealand and us, that didn't have it. And it was incredible. It was an out-of-hours case on a Sunday afternoon, and this guy rang me and said, "My pigeons are dying, can you see me?" And I said, "Oh, okay," it's Sunday afternoon. And he had 130 pigeons, all but 10 died in 4 days. And then the next 4 days, his last 10 died. And so, we got all his tests and got them away. By the end of the week, he had another 5 cases, and the diagnosis came through, so it altered everything, But anyway, so at that time, so the government then, lots of pigeons were dying, thousands of pigeons died, lots of people affected, racing was stopping, and transport companies and food companies sued and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, the CCEAD, so Consultative Committee for Emergency Animal Disease in Australia, put out a number of protocols that they thought would work to protect the Australian pigeons, and the Australian government hired us to do the work. And so we ran a vaccine trial over 18 months, and we did different vaccines, different vaccine combinations, and the results were really amazing, because the two killed the Lesotho-based strains, very commonly used, chicken-based strains initially. We found that pigeons were inoculated twice, 2 to 4 weeks apart with that. They formed incredibly high immunity, They started to form immunity within 3 days. In 28 days, 80% were fully immune against disease. By giving a second shot, you just picked up the last 20%. And the immunity was often 3 times higher than they needed to stop them getting sick. So very effective. But there are other PMV vaccines, notably one which is a live modified strain called NDV4 in Australia. And that did not form very strong immunity at all. And so that can go in the drink, or it's a drop to the nose, things like that. People are using it, you know, it's been registered in chickens and things like that, and they might be thinking they're inoculating their pigeons against PMV, but they weren't. You know, the immunity just wasn't there. And so you've got to be a little bit careful about vaccine choice. You know, is it one that someone said, oh, I've always used this for 5 or 6 years and my pigeons have never caught PMV, so it must be working? Or is it one that's been trialled in pigeons and been demonstrated to show, yes, it does form a protective immunity? So I think there's problems there. So it's difficult because, to some extent, unless you have access to the veterinary literature and the trials, and I think some of these ones that are made available might be originally registered in chickens and more commercially, you know, worthwhile vaccine for the company that's producing it. If it hasn't been trialled in pigeons, well then it just may not work, you know. So in Australia, regulation for non-registered products is pretty poor. And so, yeah, just an interesting thing. So you need to use vaccines, I think, not produced by little companies, and certainly not by some little guy who thinks it works. You know, it needs to be from a big company that's been, you know, trialled and ideally registered. You know, so it's been through the whole government rigmarole to show that it has been done. Yes.
I just want to come back to this Salmonella.
Yes.
The first thing, when you read the book from Victor von Salem, look at ChatGPT, you find that almost 100% of the people do vaccinate for PMV or for Pharyngeal.
Yes.
But very few are really doing paratyphoid or Salmonella, because some of them says after that they had bad races, some say didn't. The second thing is a lot, in your book you also stress a lot about natural immunity. But now in South Africa, if they want to vaccinate the birds for Salmonella, they put them on a combination of antibiotics like typhoid cure, which is chloromfenicol, which is a last line antibiotic, treat them for 3 weeks, and then they vaccinate the birds. Now the logic doesn't sound right to me. I mean, how do you take a bird, you want a bird to build natural immunity, and you put him for 3 weeks on one of the strongest antibiotics you can find, just to vaccinate him for paratyphoid? So can you please help me with that?
Yeah, there is a reason for that, and I can explain it to you. And so what happens if you go into a pigeon lot, and the aim is to immunise all those pigeons against Salmonella, already a good number of those birds will be infected with Salmonella. And so if they're already infected, the vaccine isn't a treatment, you know, you're not helping them to prevent disease. And so usually a variety of measures are adopted to get the Salmonella organism out of as many of those pigeons as possible, and then vaccinate them before they become reinfected. And so, for example, with the bioproperties vaccine, what the company's recommendation is that pigeons in a normal loft, or again, what they recommend is that pigeons receive a 10 to 14 day course of trimethoprim sulfadiazine, which is the common sulfur-based antibiotic, and they're given that for 10 to 14 days, and during that time the loft is sterilised a couple of times, and so you're doing as much as you can to get the bacteria out of those pigeons, cleaning the environment so there's less opportunity for reinfection from the environment. And then what you do is stop the antibiotics 2 days before vaccination, because it's a live vaccine, the antibiotics will inactivate the vaccine as well. Stop it 2 days before, which is necessary so the vaccine will work, and hope that during that time as few birds as possible will become reinfected, and then you vaccinate them straight away. So you won't, it's not a silver bullet, you won't get rid of Salmonella in all those pigeons, but as much as you can do to make as many of the birds free of Salmonella and then vaccinate them before they reinfect. So that's what those protocols are aiming to do.
So, doctors, a lot of the fanciers here say they don't do the vaccination
For PMV?
For Salmonella.
Oh, yes.
Because there are too many different strains. Are there different strains?
There's two. There's two. DT2 and DT99.
So there are only 2 strains?
They're the only ones, yeah. They're very rarely isolated from other birds or in other animals at all. And they're just thought to be contaminants. And as I said, that study, 7 out of 10,000 in other species. You know. So, no, that's not the case. It's not the case. It's just advancing technology. When they can do these DNA sequences, you know, they can really key them right out. what I was taught as a veterinary student, and what I would have told you 10 years ago, was that the salmonella infects pigeons as salmonella typhimurium, and it has the potential to infect us, because diarrhea is a disease, chickens, and a range of other animals. But it's just not the case. It's not the case. And in fact, with further research, they're finding, other salmonellas are the same, like Salmonella Dublin, ex-cattle, and there's a pigeon, a pig one and a chicken one as well, that used to, affect a number of species, or just affecting one species. Yes.
Excuse me, sir. Would it not be better then to rather test the birds for salmonella, and if they have, then give them the 10 to 14 days antibiotics?
That is a very, very good question. That's very good. So, and you have to decide, is it worth giving that long course of antibiotics or not? And so, in all lots, it may not be necessary. So you could be a racing lot, and you say, okay, I have never had any clinical salmonella in my lot that I'm aware of. Last year, the pigeons were all jumping out of the skin and they looked well. This year, they're all jumping out of their skin and looking well. I think my management and my genetics are pretty resistant to salmonella. But who knows? Next year, they might come under stress. They might be exposed to new. You might think, even if I tested all my birds, probably 1% has got salmonella as a carrier. I don't want to give all my birds those long antibiotic courses for that. In that case, just jump in and give them the shot. But then, if you're a racing lot or an exhibition lot with a genetic susceptibility like a Chopin Homer, performing like a Dominic or a tumbler, you might think, look, I get a couple with salmonella every year, and I had a few of the babies, with the bacterial infection in the joint this year. I think I have got birds with salmonella there. Well, in that situation, you would want to give them on course. And we have people give courses in between. I think maybe there's a bit there, maybe not. I'll just give them 5 to 7 days or so. But the other very good point with that, a very good question, is that it's very, very hard to detect carriers as well. So if you retrieve salmonella from a pigeon, you know it's in that pigeon. But if you don't, you can't say that it's not. And the thing is that salmonella can be a very hard organism to detect for a number of reasons. It will often be carried in the bloodstream to a range of remote sites. So it might be a tiny liver abscess, or it might be infecting a few follicles in the ovary or so. And the tests, you need to take the sample from the infected site. And so it might be just folding away as a low-grade liver infection, but you're not going to take a liver biopsy, So that bird might have the potential to seed out from there under stress, but you're not identifying it. And the other thing, of course, is that salmonella has one of these bacteria has a really strange characteristic where most bacteria, if they're engulfed by a white blood cell, the salmonella then is destroyed in the white blood cell. In salmonella, they often survive and multiply within the white blood cell. And so it's just bumping around in the pigeon system, and the antibiotics can't reach it once it's in the white blood cell. So again, it's there. So the issues are trying to tell if it is there, or even if it's there. But then certainly there's potential to modify whether you give them that antibiotic course or not. But the registered recommendation for the bioproperties one is if you want to do as much as you can to get the birds clear, is to give them that antibiotic course prior to the vaccination.
I'm so sorry to labour the point. I want to ask the last question about that. I've heard prominent pigeon fanciers who say that the years that they did inoculate against salmonella, that was their worst possible season.
Yes, and
could there be an effect of the inoculation?
Most definitely. And we had a salmonella, as I said, had a very chequered career. We had the Salmonella Vaccine. We've had 3 released. We had one released about 2.5 decades ago. That failed badly. We had one released by a smaller company based in Sydney, and the adjuvant, so the base that the vaccine was in, promoted very strong tissue inflammatory reactions. Pigeons got scars, swellings, things like that, and they were withdrawn very quickly. So I guess you need to read the literature, see if it is a registered product for use in pigeons, what are the accepted side effects, what aren't, But I fully accept that argument with some of the older, more primitive salmonella vaccines, you may well be doing your birds harm. But I think with the new ones, like the bioproperty ones, you're right. Part of the trial that we had to do for bioproperty was give a volunteer batch of my stock cogs 10 times dose and 20 times dose. And what they thought is that at 20 times dose, because the infection is bacteria persisting there for 2 to 3 hours, producing toxins that are part of the things they form their immune response against. But some of those pigeons at very high doses, they may start to feel a bit nauseous because of all the toxins being produced. And even at 20 times dose, I found about 10% of those birds, they did look a bit quite they're obviously headachy, I feel crook, but they just metabolised away and they were fine, But so I think the modern vaccines, I don't think you have that issue.
So,
yes.
You mentioned this laboratory has about 5% listed as...
The biotoxins, yes.
Is that the place where you take live pigeons to get the test?
No, they're just a pharmaceutical company that make vaccines.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
So they make Marix vaccines and ILT vaccines, and on their range they produce Salmonella.
But they take the pigeons to you for diagnosis.
Well, it's all an agent test, yes. Robert, yeah, I'm sure.
A couple of years ago, we took a very good pigeon that died to a vet, and we said, this is now a couple of years ago, maybe 5 to 10. And he said, well, since the pigeon died, we didn't the results won't be very good. The way I understood it, the samples are taken from the live pigeon, it's easier to die.
No, well, that's a good question as well. The thing with pigeons is like their body temperature is 41.7, and they're wrapped in these really good thermoregulators, feathers, and so decomposition starts very, very quickly, within 4 hours. And so a perfect sample would be a live pigeon, which you then kill, and within 4 hours you autopsy that, get all your swabs for bacterial culture, get all your tissues into formula for the specialist agent pathologist. Once you go after 4 hours, more and more things will start to slip through the net. Once you're getting over 24 hours, really large numbers of things are slipping through the net. So, your bacterial cultures, you're getting invasion by decomposition bacteria, things like that. Investigating inflammatory changes, invasion of white blood cells, did they occur pre-death, during the decomposition process, things like that. So it really depends what you're hunting. Often what we would do is, if we were looking for viral disease like herpes, adenovirus, Zika, all those, because that's very stable, we might still do an autopsy even 4 days later and say to the guy, we'll be able to tell you whether there's a viral disease there, but there'll be lots of it might be there and we can't tell you. But if we're looking for a bacterial disease, it's got to be, once you're over 4 hours, it's too hard to interpret results. Yeah.
One of the exchange has been steady in the quarter of an hour.
Sorry. Yes.
One thing is, a lot of people believe that if you vaccinate your birds once, you've got to keep vaccinating them year in, year out.
For PMV, you mean?
For paratyphoid or
right. So you're certainly not locked into a persistent immunisation cycle. When we did the PMV trials for the Australian government, we found that after 12 months, 10% of birds' immunity had dropped below the level they needed to be immune. So if those birds aren't then boosted, like if their immune systems aren't reminded by a further vaccination, all that means their immunity just falls, and past a certain point they'll become vulnerable to clinical disease. You're not actually doing them any harm. So you can elect to do them, for a period of time, and then if you think, oh, look, I've changed my mind, I don't want to persist, you just don't do them anymore. So it's okay. Yes.
Can you repeat the questions that are being asked to you? Because sometimes we can't hear what the question is, but we're getting the answer.
Sure. Okay, no problem. I can do that.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, yes, sorry, right at that.
On the vaccine, just in general, you get a live virus vaccine and a dead virus vaccine.
For PMV?
Okay. So if you got the option between a live and dead, which one would you recommend?
That's a good question as well. All I can comment on there is the vaccines that I've had experience with. With the killed Lesotho, it's a chicken origin PMV strain initially. We found that in Australia that was very effective and formed strong immunity in the pigeons. With the live PMV, and the strain we have is NDV4, and it might differ from different strains, but with that trial, The pigeons formed some immunity, but it wasn't as high as the kill, and it wasn't protective in all the pigeons. So in Australia, the recommendation is that we use the kill. But there may be other live strains in other parts of the world that would work. And of course, the other thing is that you have the European strain that is evolved. The vaccine has been developed from pigeons, and the Lesotho strain has it's a chicken origin strain that is sufficiently similar to the pigeon one. There's sufficient antigenic sharing that vaccine will form immunity in both pigeons and chickens. But because it's not identical, you've got to give them 2 shots. With the pigeon origin one, that's a vaccine that's available in Europe, you only need to give them 1, because it's identical. So 1 shot will give immunity. So that question was just whether there's difference between killed and live EMV vaccine. So in Australia, the live one not so good, but the killed one very effective. Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned earlier on that the white blood cells can engulf the salmonella.
Yes.
And encapsulate them for a period of time.
Yes.
Now, interesting about my knowledge of the lifespan of a white blood cell can be 16 days.
Mm-hmm.
So doesn't it make sense to treat them for longer than 16 days?
That's a good question, isn't it? I think it's because it's not...
Point because it's going to release those salmonella again.
Yeah, I think the thing is, though, in carriers, what happens is that you have salmonella being released and then engulfed by further white blood cells. So it's just an ongoing cycle and persistent carrier state. Yes. Oh, and so what you're saying, if they only live 16 days, if you treat it for longer than 16 days, all the white blood cells would die, release the bacteria, you get all of them. That's a good thought, but sure. But the thing is with salmonella is that it's not only in the white blood cells. It's encapsulated by scar tissue and inflammatory tissue and various organs throughout the body as well. So that's an interesting point about the 16 days. But if the aim was to get rid of the carrier state, you still achieve that. Are there any other questions there?
Some people believe when the birds come back from the race, they say they treat them immediately for cancer.
What do you think about that?
We would rather go for this natural immunity than
But you say they did have wet canker. What do you think that worked by putting in the water when they came back?
Well, that's the question of our year.
Well, I can see a couple of problems with that because the thing is that the pigeons aren't coming to the loft, all together. There would be pigeons, early and late and next morning and things like that. And you may well find that the later ones are the ones that are late because they have the wet canker, so they're not getting the same exposure to the trove. You would need to, treat those pigeons for an extended period of time, sufficiently long for the drug to work, so maybe 2, 3, 4 days, which then that makes incentive racing very difficult. If they're coming back to the same perch, a nest box, a litter, a cock, whatever, you then keep them apart from the other pigeons. How does that work? And the thing is that it's not like a disinfectant. You're not killing every canker organism that's in the loft. So that it would mean that they're going to be re-exposed once they're in the loft anyway. And if they were building up an infection, and then you're racing pigeons after 2 or 3 week break, you're racing the pigeons again, which is the longest since they've had treatment, more likely to be positive. What I think is a better approach is to just treat every bird that's in the loft at that time for an effective period of time. There will be pigeons that return who really acquire, canker infections. But the thing is that if they do have good immunity, and then the whole team is periodically treated, before that infection can build up, become established in the loft and start to affect the team as a whole, they're all treated effectively again. So they're not the odd bird going to a race with low numbers of tries, but I think it's a better approach to controlling the disease in the loft as a whole. Anyway.
You mentioned previously that it wasn't
For my loft, but that might be quite different in another loft. And look, so we just discussing whether they should be treated on return or later. and how often a very good flyer of mine, and he said something to me once that stuck in my mind, you know, and a guy called George Bella in Australia, he was one of our best flyers, and he doesn't race anymore for many years. He's about my age, very good friend. And he used to give his birds 2 days on ronidazole and 2 days on a doxycycline Thailand blend every Monday and Tuesday right through the racing season. And I said, Jesus, George, you know, like you'd probably find in your life every 3 weeks would be fine. And he said to me, Colin, they can form their immunity after the 600. You know, he didn't mind them having lots of drugs. He wanted them to be free of those diseases all the time. For 3 or 4 months, he knew the drugs didn't do them any harm. Gave them at the start of the week, or 3 or 4 days before they go, and like he flew phenomenally right through to the end. And so what it means is that when those pigeons were going to the 6, a third of their life had been on drugs for the previous 4 months, and he just as likely win the 6, you know. But the interesting thing too, and many other people in this room will have noticed that, if you treat your race team, and I noticed this in my own birds, if you treat your race team for just say 3 days on ronidazole every 2nd or 3rd week for a 4-month race program, and then breed off those race birds at the end of that season, you'll get a significantly higher level of canker in their babies. And if other people notice that as well? And the reason is, of course, they've had no cancer, you know, for months and months. They haven't been topped up, their immune systems haven't been reminded about that immunity. And so they've had the stress of a long race, the stress of raising a baby, no immunity to modify the amount of trikes they shed into their babies, and they shed large numbers and they get significant clinical disease in the baby. So if nothing else tells you the drugs are working or they're achieving their aim through racing, but it also shows the need for ongoing intermittent exposure to maintain that immunity. Very good, Dr. Sam. Oh, so a question about an immune stimulant. Look, it would be lovely if there was, and I think some vitamins in deficiency will have that effect. I think probiotics can have that effect a little bit, but they're all little things compared to just good management. Yes, yes. Yes.
Just jump to another disease, and that's malaria.
Yep.
I think it's a major problem in South Africa.
Yes.
Chicken malaria, bird malaria, pigeon malaria. Where are we going?
Well, I'm a very poor person to ask about that, and the reason is that is an extremely rare disease in Australia, and I've diagnosed that in one lot in like my 38 years of clinical practice, and yet we do like, you know, up to 10 blood smears every day looking for other things, and we would pick up a hemochromatosis if it was there. So I don't have any clinical experience with pigeon malaria. Sorry. But Dr. Roberts, I don't know why we don't have that. We look hard for it, but whether we don't have the insect vectors like the particular mosquitoes. Yeah. Well, we have mosquitoes, but whether they're the species that transmit, you know, avian malaria. Yeah, we don't have human malaria. So, yeah. But yeah, we just don't have those. Yeah. Sorry, there's a question.
That was my question.
Right, okay, yes.
Doctor, you mentioned about rats and mice not being a problem.
Salmonella, yes.
What do they do to the pigeons? Is it a problem?
Well, salmonella is not the only bacteria that will infect them, you know, and so rodents contain lots of other bacteria like E. coli that can have the. So it's still an unhygienic thing to have, you know, in a pigeon, but there's not a strong correlation with salmonella. Yes, right at the back. You what, sorry? Oh, during the race season, yes.
Are the other fancies at a disadvantage against stage?
No, not at all. And no, other fancies aren't disadvantaged by giving the soda during the race season. Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you vaccinate them before races started? Oh, to stimulate their immune system. Look, you know, people in Australia do that with pigeon pox, you know, and they say it lifts them about 10 days later, maybe, but there's no harm done. If people want to do that, It's not posing any problem. This is a killed Lesotho strain, though, isn't it?
Live.
Oh, live.
Does that affect the other birds in the same basket?
So if it's a live Lesotho strain, that would only present a problem if other pigeons in the basket hadn't been immunised. So they could become clinically infected with the Lesotho, but it's a modified non-disease causing strain. So is it going to do anything to them anyway? Maybe not. They might become infected with it, but it does. So if it's a live vaccine, they will shed that. There will be a time where they shed that virus. But if and it's likely to infect other birds in the basket, but whether it does them any harm or not, I wouldn't think so. Yes. So, yes, sorry.
You spoke just now about torching down the loft.
Yes.
Do you know a product like Burcon S?
Oh, yes, I'm familiar with Burcon, yes.
How effective would that be?
Burcon has no action against coccidia, but it's one of the disinfectants that we use in the pigeon loft, against viruses and bacteria. Yes. I think with Burcon they say it's like 4 mils into a litre and you need to keep it wet for 3 minutes or so, and that will kill circovirus, for example. So, yeah, I think those things are fine, and things like Burcon, they degrade to non-toxic byproducts. So, if you mist a bit onto a pigeon or onto the drink or onto the food, it doesn't do them any harm if they're ingested. So they have their place, certainly. Yes. Yes.
Pox vaccine, we do find now and then a wet pox, more pigeon diphtheria type of thing, rather than
the dry crusty yellow watery thing. Yeah.
Do you people have that in Australia as well?
Yes, we do. And
what do you do then?
No, we have one live modified vaccine, and it provides protective immunity against vaccinal diphtheria. And we do see that sort of mucosal wet form of pox, and we do see a skin sort of body form as well. And in fact, we had a squat farm with like 7,000 pairs of pigeons produced at the table, and they were having a significant amount of pigeons condemned when they were locked. And it turned out that they had pox that was being spread by mites. So they had lots of these little plaquey type lesions that you weren't aware of until the feathers were removed. So, yeah, so pox can be modified, but yeah, the vaccine at home against all that. Yes. So, yes.
Hi, Doc. It's a pleasure listening to you. Thanks for visiting to us. Just a couple of basic things. One, is yogurt effective as a probiotic? I've got another 2 questions.
Sure. No, we'll do one at a time. So, is yogurt effective for pigeons? Look, it may be in that it contains, organisms that do set up, populations of the bacteria and in the bowel, and probiotics do things like, prevent establishment of, potentially harmful populations of bacteria, and they keep their intestinal pH low, things like that. I think the thing though with mammal origin bacteria, because they're not really evolved to live there, so just how persistent those populations are, I think is fairly debatable. But I think you might get a transient effect, while they're passing through, and maybe for a day or two. I think the probiotic preparations that are bird origin ones are much more likely to set up persistent populations and get a prolonged benefit, because they're more at home there. But I think yogurt should be temporary short-term benefits, yeah. But yogurt's a mammal. Yeah.
So it's just a good lesson.
Yeah.
Second one, the younger disease, circovirus. Any investigations going on for any vaccine in the future?
Yes, look, that's a good question as well. There was an avian vet who's associated with Murdoch Uni, not Murdoch University, sorry, James Stewart Uni in New South Wales, and he was keen to produce a vaccine for it and started the process, and he petitioned, or asked the Australian pigeon community to try and support him in that, and he said that he needed $250,000 Australian dollars to get a basic one off the shelf, and we just didn't proceed with that. But circovirus, people are familiar with how that works. It's it gets into the loft, with that bird that died, if that had been brought to a squeaker sale, put into a loft, circovirus gets into the loft, every pigeon becomes infected. It's a very infected virus. 100% of birds, stock birds, young birds, everything becomes infected. But usually less than 5% look sick, and those 5%, get those symptoms I described, and they all most invariably die. The other 95%, clear the virus in usually under 6 months. So you get that initial wave of circovirus loss as it burns its way through the loft. If you develop overwhelming disease. The big significance of circovirus is that because one of the ways it acts is it damages this particular sort of cell, a T lymphocyte. It's an important white blood cell that's involved in young pigeons forming a natural immunity. And because they're infected, usually under 6 months of age, it means that they clear the virus. They have a very immature immune system to a 6-month-old pigeon. They haven't been able to form their immunity. So those pigeons have, persistent eye colds and wet canker and things like that. And so people can often think, this virus is, it's gone through, way back at the end of the breeding season. I lost 4 youngsters, when they were 6 weeks old or something. But the pigeons have all been well now for a couple of months, and they start tossing them, and then they have these disaster tosses or persistent health problems. And when we check them, we do those PCRs in them, they look normally still had circovirus in their system. So you've got to medically support those pigeons a little bit more until they form their natural immunity. So you do get a second wave of loss with circovirus, due to that. But yeah, there's no vaccine now available. There was a period of time a few years ago when I was in Germany that there was a lab talking about manufacturing it as well, but I don't think that proceeded either. If we were the horse racing industry and we had more money behind us, there's no sort of scientific reason why a vaccine couldn't be developed. I think just the money involved, it's just it's not happening.
The last question, Doc. A bit hot here, maybe in South Africa at the moment, doping. How do you handle the doping issues in Australia?
Yes, so I've thought about that a little bit. So when doping first did the rounds, like 10, 12 years ago in the pigeon literature, and that everyone in Australia were very excited about it. And because I'm a vet for the National Association, I became involved in, so there's a lab in Australia called Racing Analytical Services, and they adapted the test that's used on blood for horses and dogs to be used on the droppings of pigeons. And so that test can check for things like anti-inflammatory painkillers, central nervous system stimulants like caffeine, bronchodilators like aminophylline, cortisones, things like that. And we put into our sort of rules that executive members could request or collect a dropping sample from a member at any time. So you could go around there, there's all tamper-proof flip-flop bags, and the idea was that you could access a race basket or basket in night, go to the fanciest loft the next day, and in his presence, without disturbing the pigeons, flick some droppings into that, seal it in his presence, submit it to the lab, and it came back positive again. But even though that's been there, in the 10 years...
Would that be a vet or a trained person?
Oh, no, just any executive from the Federation. Yeah. And so then that would be submitted to Racing Analytical Services. But even though all that's in place, that has never been done. We've never tested one fancy. And I don't know why. Maybe Australian fanciers think, well, they kill good luck, I don't know. But they just... but I think underlying a lot of it is because we have our distance racing, we're often basketed on Wednesday and Thursday night. I can see a situation where they're being basketed on that, and droppings are being collected on the night of basketing. You get positive results. But avians metabolise a lot of those drugs so quickly. You're giving it on Thursday, they're exiting the loft 5 o'clock Thursday, being released Saturday. Are they still in the pigeon system to a point where they've exerted any race performance? I think it's probably pretty debatable. Might not be. You detect those traces, but I don't think they're really doing much. I might be wrong. Pharmacologist, but it just makes sense with other drugs. Makes me think that the only drug I think that you could probably use is something where you're getting a cumulative effect, and you could modify pigeons' result would be cortisol. And like that's well known and well published. It's a toxic drug in overdose. you need to give it in overdose to get the effects you want to enhance racing, the pigeons will build up a tolerance to it. So if you give slightly higher doses incrementally, as an eye drop into the eye or to the beak, they'll build up a tolerance, and eventually you'll get to the point where, you know, they stop molting, you get that general feeling of well-being, you know, they want to keep flying, it is an anti-inflammatory drug. So the cortisol, and you can just be doing that Wednesday and Sunday forever, you know, until after about 3 or 4 months when the toxic cumulative effects start to catch up with them and they get the osteoporosis and immune suppression and all that. But you can get that window of 3 or 4 months. So testing for cortisol is certainly, I think, important. But the other drugs, have it in place, and if you want to do it, do it. But just how much real improvement in racing you see with the other ones, I think is probably a bit debatable.
But Albert basically saying you still have to have good pigeons, you can't just shoot drugs.
Yes.
Page 131 in the flying vet, and you can read the whole story. Thank you.
That's right. Thank you. Yes.
Open lock was based.
Yes.
You will always get visitors coming straight into it.
Yeah.
What is one you? I like flying.
Yes, right. Look, you know, I don't think that really modifies anything. You probably just need to have the pigeons periodically checked and you'll pick up any problems there, you know. Oh, sorry, open lofting and exposure to feral pigeons and things like that. Yeah. Look, it's interesting, you know, I've been very lucky. I've been to lots of countries and seen lots of fanciers, and you know, certainly it's nice to have the pigeons open lofting and that. But I look at the, you know, really, really successful fanciers, and it's interesting. It's a matter of what is adequately good. You know, you go to a lot of lofts, and you know, you think, oh, but maybe they're a bit dirty, and you look at the pigeon, oh, it doesn't make any difference, things like that. And you can have a pigeon that is 95% right, and that can become the normal for you, as good as they can get, you know. And some of the lofts that I've been to, and I've been lucky, fancy really successful fanciers from 600 and 700 miles. We've got one fancier in Australia, a guy called Gary Mountjoy. No one here will have heard of him. You know, you hear of the fanciers that promote themselves a little bit. But you know, Gary, he's the sort of flyer who will breed, you know, a small number of pigeons. He'll still have at least 40% of them in the loft at the end of the season and available to send to the distance races. He will send 10 to a race and have 4 come in the top 30 at 600 miles, 500 miles. And you go to those guys and their management is so spot on. I remember once I went down to about, you know, it was a week after he won a national, 9,700 pigeons, 440 miles, 11-hour race, and he won that in his 4th with his 2nd pigeon, and then sent 10. And I went and I handled those pigeons, and they were absolutely flowing. You know, when you're sort of basketing for a 5 or a 6, you know, and you think, oh, that one's good enough to go, that one's good enough to go. Gee, that one's really sparkling, you know, and that one's good enough to go. I think the trick is, it's pretty easy to get the ones, oh, that's good enough to go. 90% of the ones that you handle when you're basketing are like that, and they fly the line, and depending on the level of the competition in, they can win their prizes and be good. But then you get that little bit of extra lift where they're just sparkling, you know. And look, it can be very simple where we had a very simple case last year where this guy just wasn't doing very well. And we ran a blood profile and found the type of anemia that you get with iron deficiency. And you think, how did the pigeon become iron deficient? You know, it's in dirt, it's in pit, it's in pink minerals. Anyway, we were talking to him, and what he does is he thought that having greeting the crop with the stomach would compromise them during racing, and if you put it there, they ate a lot, so he thought that was going to do some harm, but of course they were eating a lot because they were deficient in the things that he claimed. And he didn't open loft them, and he scraped the loft meticulously, and they're young growing pigeons, and they became iron deficient. So they've got impaired oxygen carrying capacity in the blood. And so we just put those pigeons onto a water-soluble iron supplement, then 10 days later, they were deficient, you know. So, you know, it can be very subtle at times, but, you know, it's easy to get pigeons 95% right, and you see pigeons win that, you know, may have a bit of rectangular, and, you know, you're finding a coccygeal egg on every 2nd or 3rd microscope field. If you're in a competition with 20 members, you know, you can still be the champion. But then when you see the the really super successful ones, you know, there's that extra 5% in the international, quite normal. We had some of the performances that were put up by some of the flies and the birds in Australia climb these enormous distances, and they're just really, really fit the way they should be. But that can be the trap, to think that a 95% pigeon, yeah, he's fine. That's what the racing pigeon looks like. But when you see the really 100% ones, there's the difference. Yeah, so that's what we want. Yeah.
So when a bird comes back from a long race, what's the best thing to give it to drink when it arrives?
That's a good suggestion as well. I think I don't give them any drugs. I think the important thing is to focus on the pigeons becoming well really quickly. And so usually this is just with my own, I'll give them some probiotics, some avian origin probiotics, or sometimes I'll give them half-strength vitamins because I want them to drink really well. And this is, I'm people tricky down to this, but I think in some circumstances there might be benefit in giving electrolytes after a race as well, but not as a routine thing. I think if a pig pigeon is sent that's been on the wing under, say, 6 to 8 hours on a not hot day and it doesn't look distressed when it comes back, I don't think electrolytes are going to make a difference, But if they're coming on a hot day, they haven't been really fit enough for the job at hand, they're coming a little bit of distress, or if it's over 8 hours, say, I think we'll use some electrolytes. Most of the registered electrolyte preparations are registered for birds, not only adapted dog or swine. They also have some simple sugars in there as well. Oh, and they may also have some simple sugars in there as well, and pigeons don't have to digest glucose, it's just passively absorbed through the stomach wall. So I think they're getting a bit of sodium, bicarbonate, chloride, potassium, and some simple sugars. I think that might help. But otherwise just probiotics and maybe high-strength vitamins. Yeah. That's a good question, isn't it? Yeah.
Overdose.
Oh, that's a good question too. So overdose of iron, that certainly happens. Pigeons absorb iron to the system really quickly and excrete very poorly. And so we see that as well too. And so hemosiderosis, so excessive accumulation of iron in the liver. And so you normally get to that either at autopsy at the end of the season where the pigeons weren't right, a lot of them didn't come into form, and you autopsy one and find that, and we find that often. Not often, but we find it periodically. Or you run your blood profile and find your liver enzymes are up, and then maybe review the diet or do a liver biopsy with a live bird or elect a colon at that stage. Yeah. So yeah, that's right. So, sorry, what? Peroxide, like H2O2? Yeah. Why? I don't think so. That's a no. I don't think that is. We'd like this through because I think for a long time you'll probably still be awake. So this is just your classic salmonella. Everyone's seen that. That's salmonella in the testicle. That's salmonella in an ovary. That's salmonella in the abscess, in the liver. We talked a bit about vaccination. I mentioned this. So crop stimulants. So this is not sort of hocus pocus. Some guy did it and he won the 500, so it must be good. This was presented at the International Avian Vets Conference about 3 or 4 years ago. So fennel tea doesn't contain caffeine, so you can use that. But that's been shown to enhance crop emptying in pigeons, particularly if they're run down. So pigeons, when they get run down, the crop will see delayed emptying. So it's nice to get the crop empty because they need the fluid, they need the energy. And so this, you just make it up like a cup of tea for yourself with fennel and put that in the water. The other thing that I do, I think it makes a difference if you're looking for that 1%, the extra 2 minutes on race day. Yeah, and maybe I'm paranoid, but I think pigeons on cold days benefit from having their drinking water warmed. And in my old loft, I raced to the previous loft 25 years, and it was a garden, it was a loft on the roof of my garage, and the water was municipal water that just came out of a cold tap, and with very cold mornings, pigeons working, exhale breath condensing on the beak, really working hard, and they come in, and they're hot, and they'd have an eat, and then they'd go and have their drink. And you think that like, almost like an ice cream freeze, and they drink that. With the new lot, it's part of the house. It's part of the second floor of the house. So it's got hot and cold water. It shows how weird it is. But anyway, and so I just thought, oh, it's warmish, and it's interesting. Those pigeons will come in and they eat, and then they go to the drinker and they drink and drink. They don't have to stop because it's cold, it's freezing, you know. And they drink and they drink and they drink. I think that makes a difference, you know. So you can imagine those pigeons if they're having a warm drink with something like tea in it. I think that's going to help, you know. And the other thing I mentioned as well, because I'm always very wary of focus sort of. You know, I like real drugs, peer-reviewed, shown to work in the veterinary literature. Their side effects, their benefits are beyond repute. But this is a thing produced by Avian Labs, which is a European company, and all it is powdered beetroot. You know, it's weird, it's powdered beetroot. But what it's meant to do, and this does seem to help, is it enhances oxygen delivery to the muscles, and it's meant to do that. It appears to by just dilating the peripheral circulation, so you're getting blood flowing to the extremities and getting good oxygen delivery. And I've tried that, and the pigeons do seem to benefit from that. And even if it doesn't do that, you know, that is like it's a nutritious natural source of nutrients, vitamins, and minerals. So I quite like that product as well. But they're the only sort of two non-pharmaceutical things that I would use. And just very, very. For a second, touching on things there, I am sure of the benefits of a multivitamin, mineral, amino acid supplement that's been made for use in pigeons. And I think that's worthwhile. No grain blend will provide all of the nutrients that pigeons need. They're a very good company in Australia called Laukies, and they really helped me a lot. They have a nutritionist there, and what they can do these days is with a computer program, you put in, okay, we know exactly how much cobalt, thionine, vitamin D, vitamin A, you know, a pigeon needs. And so if we give a nutritional ration that's 40% peas, 20% corn, 10% safflower, and you know what the nutrients are in it, so you just push the button, and the computer goes zing, and it quickly tells you, so the amount of vitamin B that pigeon's getting is this, the amount of thionine is this. So with like 30 or 40 key nutrients. And so then you say, okay, well, it's a bit deficient in that. What happens if you give them 5% more wheat? You know, try and get your wheat germ and your vitamin E up, push the button, and again it tells you. And we tried, and there was no grain blend that provided a complete and balanced diet. So that's impossible. And so you're picking up some with access to a good quality grid, but there are some nutritional deficiencies. And I think often they don't cause clinical disease because many race pigeons in Australia don't live to their first birthday. You know, they don't live long enough to develop, you know, these long-term nutritional, you know, people lose, you know, half their teens, you know, before distance races water, distance races cold. Some only keep some 2-year-olds that are warranted for that. So, you know, these subtle deficiencies don't appear to be noticed, but you know the diets are deficient. And so what we experimented with our kids is making these nutritional balances. So we'd say, okay, the common race diet is this. To make that a complete diet, all we do is we'd add 5% of these pellets, you know, that can make it up. But it works well for stock birds. In fact, my stock birds have had pellets for 20 years, you know, my babies don't see grain until they're weaned, and there are 17 and 18-year-old stock birds that have never eaten grain. But what would happen in a race stock, where a major incentive is food, you don't want them to, you know, eat too much and things like that, is they would come in, eat the grain, leave the pellets, and then the other ones through hunger would eat the pellets. So you couldn't guarantee they'd all eat the amount. And so what I do, and it's just, you know, it's one product that I use, and I give that to my pigeons just every Monday. And I think, well, I'm not going to cause any overdoses on that, but I know it's formulated and it's appropriate, and any subtle deficiencies they'll pick them, you know. And I just put that in the water every Monday. They have that. It's sweet. They guzzle it down. That's it, you know. So mine have the race birds, the stock birds have the pellets. The race birds have the grain mix. They have this product in the water every Monday, and they have 50 minerals all the time.
Sorry, what do they have on Monday mornings?
No, it's in the water. Sorry, it's in the water all day.
Okay, thank you.
It's a water soluble.
Earlier when you were sliding, you showed a picture of a tonsil with white spots with that.
Yes.
What do you take on that white spot? Are they detrimental or indication of previous?
Yes. So there's about 17 things. There are 17 things that we're aware of that will cause those white spots, and they range from respiratory, like the infectious process, like red canker or respiratory infection, where the birds have had a tonsillitis, and then that progresses to the stage where you get little pockets of inflammatory debris, so like little pimples or abscesses through the tonsil, and so they'll form that way. More likely to get them with vitamin A deficiency, because the membrane is more vulnerable to vitamin A deficiency. But there are some other diseases that specifically cause disease. They're like herpes, mycobacterial diseases, some of the cancers as well. So they're never normal. There's always a reason for it. But in race birds, it's usually some inflammatory process in the throat. It usually turns out to be a form of respiratory infection or red canker. But seeing them there doesn't necessarily mean that the infection is active now. But it means at some point there was, you might have effectively treated them, but then the infection is now resolved and the tonsil's healing. But it tells you either now or in the recent past there was a problem.
I've got your opinion on two things. A lot of the guys have started, which we picked up from the European laws, is the 10-day treatment based on before the season.
People do that in Australia as well. I think that is a very, very poor practice. What are they doing with that? What are they doing? Why? What does that do? And I guess the whole point is, so giving an antibiotic. So let's see, Baytril overdose. It can cause embryonic death. Each state by hens that have been recently on that antibiotic. If it's given to growing babies, it can interfere with normal joint development, it gives cartilage deposition of the joint, pretty well decimates all the good bacteria that pigeons need for nutrient absorption and digestion. It's not a good respiratory choice. If the birds have salmonella, you're not going to eradicate it a lot, because unless you follow up with vaccination, the ones that you did treat are probably going to reinfect the disseminated viral carriers. I don't think that serves any purpose at all. I think that's a blind treatment we want to avoid through testing and targeted treatment, so we give them the drugs they need. So, they have the doxycycline, before one of those four categories. We give them the canker drugs if you're getting positives on the flushes, but they look back as to why the canker's there. Treat the parasitic diseases. Consider vaccinating against salmonella and do vaccinating against Pharyngeal Tonsil. No, I'm glad you asked that, because that's one thing we really don't want to be giving racing pigeons. We don't really want the racing community associated with giving land antibiotics like that. Yes,
And the other thing, in South Africa we've got a product called Pigeon.
Sodium hypochlorite, I guess bleach. Yes.
Some of the guys are giving to the birds. What's your opinion on
So sodium hypochlorite is bleach, and on exposure we're exposed to salt and CO2. I use bleach in my loft to sterilise my drinkers. It's not a therapeutic agent. It's not designed for internal use. I can't see that. Right? A lot of vets in South Africa. And so you'd be aware, like if you put bleach into I've just got a huge wheelie here, and every Monday after it's had the vitamins, because the vitamins stain the fingers a little yellow, I put all the drinkers in there, leave them there overnight, bring them out the next morning, they're spotless, rinse them off, and that's the drinkers for the next week. So I use bleach for that purpose. There's no therapeutic. Yes. Apple cider vinegar is acetic acid, and so that can go, 5 ml per litre water, and as it goes through, it maintains a weakly acidic environment in the crop, upper small intestine. Disease-causing bacteria like Salmonella prefer an alkaline environment. So it's a natural thing that can help to protect the bird against bacterial invasion. So that's okay. Yeah. Oh no, I don't. If I really do, I think the theory behind using it is fine, and in the circumstances it may be a benefit. It doesn't do pigeons any harm. But I felt I wanted to do something to acidify the bowel. I would use a probiotic by far outside vinegar, because probiotics, of course, acidify the bowel, but do all those other things as well, like flood the bowel with good bacteria, set up protective barrier layers, protective mucus layers, a whole lot of things. So if I wanted to do that, I'd use probiotics over the outside vinegar. And I said that, yeah, so drinking water, oh my God, oh, it should be neutral, like 7, so it's neutral, yeah. In normal melting. I was just going to say too, if I did have a recurrent bacterial infection in the crop or the bowel, another good approach would be to investigate that infection, put a name to the bacteria, so I didn't have the curiosity.
I wrote to Peter Boskop, who is the Dutch vet, I think you may
I don't know, but I know of him. Yes.
You know of him?
Yes.
And his answer to me was a pH between 4.8 and 5.
Okay.
Is the ideal pH.
Of the drinker?
Of the drinker, yes.
Yes, a weekly acidic, yeah.
And I had my birds tested over the last 2 years, and I haven't tested positive for trichomoniasis at all, once. And the claim is that the lower pH of trichomoniasis doesn't live in that pH, so you don't get the distribution. Because when the birds drink, they spit in the water as well, and that distributes the canker.
Yes, oh yes, I think so.
So, and I had my birds tested. I said, the last 2 years I haven't treated for canker, and I haven't
needed to.
And I haven't
but
had
that's an interesting
any.
observation. That's an interesting observation. It may well come out of it. Yes, look, I know, and I've sort of been through that whole decades, the way that people have, and Epsom salts, it's magnesium sulfate, and what it does, you're giving them a concentrated salt solution, and the body has evolved that fluid will move across the bowel wall to make the dilution of nutrients, and that's those salts, the same both sides. And so it's a little bit like drinking seawater. If you give a concentrated salt solution, fluid will move out of the body into the bowel, and you get an osmotic diarrhea. So the fluid is moved to make the concentration of those salts the same both sides of the bowel. Because the bowel is much more concentrated, fluid moves out of the body into the bowel to dilute it. So the pigeons produce large amounts of very watery droppings, and in doing that, you're dehydrating the birds. And the thought was that, like I've seen them pass, gizzard stains and that, and the idea was that you're flushing out all the toxins and doing all that. I think it's just absolute rubbish, That would be a really great way to put pigeons who are in that top 2% of race form. That's going to be difficult to hydrate them, and make all their systems kick in to try and get all their body salts right again, That's all hocus pocus. That's not only the 20th century, but the 19th. So I think we'll probably wind it up there. We've all had a cup of coffee and a chop. But look, I'd like to thank you very much for coming today and for being such an attentive audience. You've been very, very quiet. And as I said before, my wife and I have been to South Africa 4 times and enjoyed coming here. We've always enjoyed really fantastic hospitality that makes good things here. Some of them I think we might. So thank you very much. Thank you.